The forest does not forgive. That is what old voices have whispered for generations, though most never stop long enough to listen. It stretches endlessly, its black canopy swallowing even the boldest starlight. Once you step past the tree line, the world shifts. The silence deepens as if the woods themselves are watching, waiting, remembering. Across countless years, hikers, hunters, and campers have entered places like these, convinced that they understood nature, convinced they could command fire and compass to bend the wilderness to their will. But the forest has its own memory, its own law. Those who forget it vanish, and those who return often speak little, their eyes hollow, their words uncertain, their stories left trembling between truth and madness. The story begins not with a scream, not with blood, but with something far colder. Imagine a campfire glowing faintly against the dark. It should be a comfort, the center of warmth and light. Yet here in the depth of the woods it feels fragile. The trees press inward, silent pillars, their jagged branches etched against the night sky. Beyond the ring of firelight there is only shadow, endless and thick. The night air carries no sound, not even the common comfort of insects or the cry of owls. Just the low crackle of wood burning, alive only for as long as fuel remains. It is in such places that the human imagination begins to fray. Campers claim that the fire flickers differently, as if unseen movement disturbs the air. They claim the woods close tighter with each passing minute, suffocating the boundary between human presence and the unknown. And when the fire dies, the dark does not simply return, it swallows. Entire groups have vanished without leaving even the ash of their fires behind. The forest keeps them, deep within a silence too heavy to endure. There are documented cases, of course, reports filed and forgotten, often blamed on poor preparation or wild animals. Yet the details bleed through the lines, tents left unzipped but untouched, food still waiting, boots neatly by the fire, no claw marks, no tracks, only absence, only the sense that something pulled them away, deeper into the tree line where light could not follow. One story stands out among the countless whispers, and it begins with a simple fact that cannot be shaken. A group of campers set out into a forest known for its remoteness, eager to escape the noise of their daily lives. They walked in laughing, their packs heavy with supplies, their minds clear with anticipation. They did not walk out. When their campsite was found, the fire had burned to embers, the logs arranged carefully as if waiting for a return that never came. Their belongings sat where they had been placed. Their tent doors hung open, gently swaying in the wind. But the people themselves were gone, every trace of them swallowed. Think about the last moment they saw one another. The fire crackling, the shadows bending between the trees. One glance exchanged, a nervous laugh, perhaps a whispered question. "Did you hear that? Did you see something move?" The silence would have answered, and in that silence, something else. A presence, a pull, the understanding that they were no longer alone. Human fear is not born from blood. It is born from recognition, the recognition that something vast and unknowable is near, watching, waiting. In the forest, this truth presses heavier than anywhere else. The campers may have stood, unsure whether to search the trees or return to their tent. They may have heard the sound of branches shifting without wind, or footsteps pressing into soil with no body attached. It does not matter what they did next. The fact remains, their voices fell silent and the forest never gave them back. Searchers who came after described the sight with unease. Some refused to speak of what they felt. They claimed the air was heavy, as if the woods did not want them there. They claimed they heard faint sounds, whispers threaded through the pines, or the far-off laughter of people who should not have been there at all. And when they turned their flashlights into the trees, they swore they saw figures standing between the trunks, too still, too patient, gone the instant the light shifted. What could take an entire group without leaving a trace? What could move so quietly, so deliberately that no one resisted, no one escaped, no one even screamed? These are the questions that linger, unanswered, gnawing at the edges of reason. Was it human? Was it animal? Or was it something else entirely? Something older, something that lives in the silence and waits for the fire to burn low. You can still go to that place. You can walk the trail they walked, see the trees that swallowed them. But when night falls and the fire burns low, the forest will remind you of what it holds. The silence will grow heavy, the shadows will shift, and you may find yourself staring into the dark, asking the same question they must have asked just before the end. What is waiting out there, beyond the light? The forest has not forgotten. The forest lay far beyond the reach of towns. in a stretch of land where roads thinned to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to nothing but narrow trails that bent into the wilderness like veins through flesh. For centuries, this place had resisted settlement. It was not that people had never tried. Small logging camps rose and fell, each leaving behind little more than rusting tools and abandoned cabins consumed by moss. Hunters spoke of the richness of game, of deer that moved through the fog like silent shadows, of streams filled with cold fish. Yet those same hunters often returned changed if they returned at all. Some swore the forest was cursed. Others said it was sacred, a place not meant for permanent human touch. The elders of nearby villages carried stories that stretched back generations, whispers of figures that moved between the trees. Not animal, not human, but something in between, something older than the first names carved into bark. Into this setting came the group. They were not the first to enter, nor would they be the last, but they carried the same hope so many before them had carried, the hope of escape. They wanted the silence, the distance from roads and wires, the chance to sit beneath an open sky without the hum of electricity, without the dull roar of engines. They were young enough to believe themselves invincible, yet old enough to carry quiet burdens they could not voice. Work, responsibility, the growing weight of lives that had already begun to close in on them. The forest to them was freedom. The air was clear, the stars sharp. Their laughter carried easily that first day, bouncing off the trunks as they moved deeper and deeper, farther from anyone who could hear them. They brought with them everything they thought they would need. Packs heavy with food sealed in bags, thick sleeping rolls, maps, even a worn compass that had belonged to a grandfather. They spoke of long nights by the fire, of stories they would tell, of memories they would carve into the earth before walking out days later, refreshed, alive, whole. There was no reason to think otherwise. The forest looked quiet still. It had the air of something endless, patient, waiting. The site they chose was a small clearing near a stream. The ground there was soft with pine needles, the sky open enough to let the fire breathe. They set their tent carefully, arranging their belongings with a sense of order, preparing for days of simple living. When the fire rose that first night, the glow lit their faces, their eyes reflecting the flame. They spoke of ordinary things, friends, futures, the world beyond the tree line. Yet already the forest was listening. Already, in the press of shadows just beyond their circle of light, something stirred. Older residents in the nearest village remembered hearing the news. They remembered how the story traveled fast, as all strange stories do. A group had gone missing. Their campsite discovered, but their bodies gone. At first it was treated as a simple tragedy, lost hikers, a possible accident. But the longer the search stretched on, the stranger it seemed. The woods, they said, were not kind to those who ignored its rules. And these rules were not written on paper, not marked on maps. They were known in whispers. Never wander after dusk. Never stray from firelight. Never follow the sound of voices you cannot see. The campers had not known these rules, or if they had, they did not believe them, and the forest does not forgive disbelief. The history of the land is stained with such absences. A hunter who left his cabin to check his traps, never to return. A surveyor who mapped the region and vanished before the ink dried. Families who swore they heard knocking at their doors at night, even though their cabin stood miles from the nearest road. And deeper still, the stories that never left the mouths of the old ones. Those who spoke of figures with hollow eyes, faces blurred as if carved from shadow, standing just at the edge of sight. The forest was not empty. It had never been empty. But for the group, that history was invisible. Their eyes saw beauty. Their lungs drew clean air. They lay beneath the stars and felt for a brief moment untouched by the world. This was their mistake, though it was not a sin of arrogance but of innocence. They did not realize that beauty can be a mask, that silence can hide intention. They believed the forest would leave them alone because they had done nothing to provoke it. But the forest does not care for reasons. It cares only for balance, and balance in its own dark way was waiting to be restored. The emotional stakes of what would happen were already written, even if they could not see it. Families waiting for them at home, expecting photographs, stories of adventure, voices alive with joy. Parents certain that their children would return as they had promised. Friends sure that the trip was nothing more than a pause, a short escape before life resumed. But as the days passed and silence grew, those same families would find themselves calling into the void, receiving no answer. The joy that should have been carried back was swallowed, replaced with absence. The forest has a way of taking what is not offered. It leaves holes not only in the land but in those who wait, holes that cannot be filled. This is the true cruelty. Not the disappearance itself, but the lingering absence it leaves behind. The group had walked into the woods with laughter, believing they would return with memories. Instead, they returned as silence. And silence, once it takes root, spreads far beyond the tree line. The first night passed without incident, or at least that is what it must have seemed. The group sat around their fire, the flames curling upward, casting faces in flickering shades of gold and black. Their voices carried in the stillness, rising and falling like a tide against the endless silence of the trees. For a time the forest gave no answer. The only sound was the steady crackle of the firewood, the shifting of bodies on the ground, the occasional splash of water from the nearby stream. It felt in those early hours like a sanctuary, a place where time slowed, where the world beyond could no longer intrude. They must have felt safe. That is always how it begins. It was only later, after laughter thinned and voices trailed into drowsy murmurs, that they began to notice it. The silence was not ordinary. It did not feel like the calm hush of a sleeping forest. It was heavier, pressing into their ears, filling the spaces between heartbeats. Not a single insect stirred, not a single owl cried from the distance. The forest had gone still, as if it were holding its breath. They tried to dismiss it, telling themselves it was nothing, that perhaps the wilderness was simply different here. Yet unease spread slowly, like a shadow creeping closer with each second. Someone may have asked, almost in a whisper, if the others had noticed. Perhaps nervous laughter followed, quickly silenced because acknowledging it made it real, and still they heard nothing. By the second night, the unease grew. They swore they heard something moving in the undergrowth beyond the circle of firelight. The sound was subtle, like footsteps dragging over pine needles, slow, deliberate, pacing just outside their vision. Each time someone turned a flashlight toward the sound, there was nothing but trees, still and patient, their rough bark swallowing the weak beam of light. They told themselves it was animals, perhaps deer, perhaps something smaller, curious about the fire. They tried to believe it, but the footsteps returned, always circling, always pausing when they listened too closely. There was a rhythm to it, a waiting as though the forest itself were studying them. On the third morning, one of them noticed something strange. A small object they had left by the fire, perhaps a tin cup, perhaps a folded cloth, was gone. At first it seemed trivial, the sort of thing that could be misplaced, buried beneath packs or rolled beneath the edge of the tent. But they searched and it was nowhere to be found. The ground showed no disturbance, no sign of animals dragging it away. It was simply gone. The others tried to reassure themselves, but the thought lingered. If such a small thing could vanish without explanation, what else could be taken? That night the forest pressed closer. The fire burned low, though they fed it constantly, unwilling to let the flames falter. Shadows stretched long and bent in unnatural ways, twisting across the ground, elongating into shapes that did not match the movement of the branches above. One of them claimed they saw a figure standing among the trees, tall, still fixed in place. A trick of the light, perhaps, a merging of trunk and shadow. But when they blinked, it was gone, leaving only emptiness behind. They said nothing at first, unwilling to feed the fear that was already creeping through the group. But fear does not need words to grow. It spreads silently, from glance to glance, from silence to silence, until every breath feels colder than the last. By the fourth day, tension had replaced ease. Their laughter was quieter, their movements sharper, their eyes drawn constantly to the tree line. Each sound was a question, each silence an accusation. The forest, once open and alive, now seemed hostile. Even the stream seemed different, its flow too loud, masking whatever might be moving just beyond sight. They spoke less, as though words themselves might draw attention. The joy that had brought them here was gone, replaced with a quiet dread they could not name. They wanted to leave, perhaps, but pride or stubbornness held them. Or maybe it was something else, something that made them believe leaving was no longer possible. The nights were the worst. The wind shifted strangely, blowing cold across the fire, yet leaving the trees unmoved. Branches creaked, though no storm passed overhead. And always the feeling of being watched lingered. Not the ordinary unease of solitude, but the undeniable sense of eyes fixed upon them. Unblinking, patient. They tried to sleep, curling into their sleeping bags, but sleep never came fully. They woke in fragments, jolting at every sound, clutching at every rustle of fabric. And when they opened their eyes, they swore they saw shadows moving across the walls of the tent, too deliberate to be tricks of the flame. The forest seemed to be tightening around them, as if drawing in with every nightfall. What had begun as escape was becoming a cage. They could not shake the feeling that each step they had taken deeper into the woods had carried them across a line they could not see, into a place they were not meant to be. And once crossed, such a line could never be undone. Something had noticed them. Something had drawn closer. The silence was no longer absence. It was presence. It was waiting. The group may have begun to argue quietly, voices tense with fatigue and fear. Some insisted it was all in their minds, the product of nerves, of darkness, of imagination twisting ordinary sounds into threats. Others swore they knew what they felt, that no imagination could invent the weight of that gaze in the dark. They were trapped between belief and denial, each explanation more terrifying than the last. If it was real, they were not safe. If it was not, then their own minds were betraying them. Both paths led to the same fear, the same question that none of them dared to voice aloud. Would they walk out of the forest at all? The answer was already waiting, and the forest, patient as ever, was closing its hand around them. When the group failed to return, it was not panic at first. Families waited an extra day, believing perhaps the forest had simply stretched the trip longer than planned. When another day passed without contact, voices sharpened and the alarm began to grow. Authorities were called, though even they carried the usual dismissive tone that follows missing campers. They said it happened often. People miscalculated distances, they got lost. They underestimated the difficulty of the land. It would be a matter of retracing steps, of following trails, of bringing them back safely. That was the expectation. What followed was nothing like expectation. The search began at the trailhead and moved inward. Rangers and volunteers pressed through the dense undergrowth, calling names that dissolved into the trees without answer. Dogs were brought in, their noses sharp, their instincts keen, but the dogs reacted strangely. Instead of pulling forward, eager to follow scent, they froze. Some whined, ears pressed back, refusing to move past certain points in the trail. Others barked wildly at the empty air, their eyes fixed on shadows between the trunks as if something stood there that no one else could see. Handlers tried to urge them forward, but more than once the animals bolted back toward the road, straining at their leashes, desperate to escape. When they reached the campsite, the unease deepened. The tent was still there, unzipped, its fabric swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, sleeping bags lay arranged as if waiting for occupants, belongings carefully placed. Food supplies were untouched, hanging high in the trees to keep animals away. The fire pit was filled with cooled embers, neatly arranged logs beside it prepared for another night. Nothing had been torn apart, nothing scattered. No signs of struggle, no signs of departure. It was as if the campers had risen quietly in the night and walked out into the woods, leaving every possession behind. But why? The investigators began cataloging details. The ground bore no clear footprints leading away, only the faint imprints of boots circling the fire from nights before. The soil beyond was undisturbed, the pine needles undisturbed, no trail of departure. They searched along the stream, expecting perhaps to find clothing or signs of drowning, but the water revealed nothing. A search of the surrounding woods uncovered no broken branches, no signs of panic, no blood. It was as though the group had dissolved into the air, leaving only the echo of their presence. Locals who had been watching the search came forward quietly with stories. Some said they had heard voices carried on the wind at night, laughter where no one should have been. Others swore they had seen distant lantern light moving through the trees, too far from the search parties, too precise to be mistaken for stars. When asked for proof, they fell silent, their words faltering as though afraid to say more. It is one thing to speak of strange things in passing. It is another to put them into the hands of officials who will dismiss them as superstition. Reports were filed. Statements gathered. Each searcher added their account, and in those pages a pattern began to emerge. Many spoke of the same feeling, an oppressive weight in the air, a silence that seemed unnatural. Some admitted they felt watched, their nerves frayed with every step. A few swore they saw movement at the edge of their vision, shadows bending where shadows should not bend, figures disappearing the instant a light was turned toward them. These accounts were buried beneath the official wording of the reports, but they remain, scribbled in margins, whispered between those who were there. Artifacts were scarce, but one detail was repeated often. Near the edge of the clearing where the ground sloped downward, A single tree was marked. The bark was gouged in a strange way, not like claw marks, not like a knife. The lines were jagged, uneven, forming no recognizable pattern but arranged too deliberately to be dismissed as random. Some said it looked like symbols, half-formed, etched into the wood. Others said it looked like scratches made by desperate hands. No explanation was ever given, and the tree itself was left standing as though no one wanted to touch it again. Psychologists brought into the discussion suggested possibilities. Group hysteria, they said. Stress compounded by isolation. The mind creating threats where none existed. One camper panicked, the others followed. They might have wandered into the woods, disoriented, unable to find their way back. Exposure, dehydration, the ordinary killers of the wilderness. These were the rational explanations, and on paper, they made sense. But they did not account for the lack of tracks. They did not account for belongings left untouched. They did not account for the silence or the fear that even trained searchers admitted they felt. Rationality explained part of it, but not all of it. Others suggested darker human causes. Perhaps another person had been in the woods, unseen. A stranger who watched, waited, and finally took them. Yet no sign of intrusion was found. No discarded objects, no sign of struggle, no evidence of violence. If another person had been responsible, they moved with impossible precision, erasing every trace, leaving behind only the hollow echo of absence. As the days stretched on, the search widened. Helicopters scanned from above, their blades tearing at the silence, their spotlights cutting across the trees. Nothing. Rivers were dragged, hills combed. Nothing. The forest seemed determined to hold what it had taken. The evidence pointed everywhere and nowhere. Some pieces suggested panic. Others suggested deliberate departure. Still others whispered of something beyond human understanding, something not bound by ordinary rules. And in that confusion, a single truth rose. The forest had taken them. Whether by natural means or something else, the land had absorbed them into its silence. The reports closed with words like inconclusive and unresolved, but those who walked the site never forgot. Years later, if you ask those who searched, their eyes darken. They say the forest is not empty. They say it remembers. They say the evidence does not matter because the truth is not in the reports. The truth is in the silence that hangs there still, the silence that presses against your skin when you stand in that clearing, staring at an empty tent that should have been filled with life. The truth is that the forest never gives back what it claims. When the official reports closed, when the headlines began to fade, the story did not end. It never truly ends in cases like this. It shifts, it lingers, it sinks into the bones of those who remain. Families who once waited by the phone found themselves waiting still. Long after calls ceased and updates dried to nothing. At first there was hope, a desperate clinging to the idea that someone would stumble out of the forest gaunt but alive, carrying a story of survival against all odds. That hope withered slowly, replaced not by acceptance but by something far colder, uncertainty. The bodies were never found. No graves were dug. And so there was no closure, only absence, absence that grew heavier with every passing day. Parents sat in rooms untouched since the moment their children left, belongings still arranged neatly on beds, shoes lined by doors, photographs on shelves. These spaces became shrines to what was lost. Dust gathered but was never disturbed, because to move anything was to admit that life had gone on without them. Families walked a line between memory and denial, their grief sharpened by the silence of the forest that still held what they could not reach. Some spoke of dreams where the missing returned, standing at doorways, their faces pale, their eyes shadowed. They did not speak. They only stared, as though asking why no one had come for them. In the community, the impact spread like a sickness. Neighbors who once spoke freely began to watch the woods with suspicion. Children who had played near the tree line were kept indoors, their parents' eyes darting to the forest as though it might reach out and take them too. Stories of the disappearance became warnings spoken in hushed tones. Do not wander too far. Do not follow voices at night. Do not go where the trees grow too thick. The old whispers returned, and with them, a paranoia that seeped into every corner of daily life. Those who had taken part in the search carried their own scars. Rangers who once walked confidently beneath the canopy found themselves glancing over shoulders, listening too closely to silences that seemed too deep. Some refused to return to that section of the forest at all, their fear disguised as practicality. They said it was a waste of time, that resources were better spent elsewhere. But their eyes betrayed them. They remembered the unease, the weight, the sense that the forest itself was watching them as they searched. One searcher confessed, years later, that he felt certain something had followed him out of the woods. He never went back, but he swore that even in his home, miles from the tree line, he sometimes woke in the night to the feeling of eyes fixed on him through the glass of his window. The psychological toll was not only on those directly tied to the missing. The forest itself became a wound in the collective mind of the community. People spoke of it less but thought of it more. They avoided its trails yet dreamed of them. They told themselves the disappearances were explained. Missteps, accidents, predators. But the explanations never settled. They hovered like unfinished sentences, leaving the unease raw and unhealed. Families gathered at anniversaries, lighting candles, placing photographs on tables, whispering prayers into the silence. They spoke of the laughter they could still hear in memory, the ordinary sound of voices that had been stolen. They wondered aloud what had become of them, if they had suffered, if they had known fear in those final moments. The questions had no answers, and that absence hollowed them out. Grief without proof becomes something worse than grief. It becomes doubt. It becomes torment. Some grew bitter, convinced that more should have been done, that answers had been buried, that the truth had been ignored. They turned their suspicion not only toward the forest, but toward those who had led the search. Rumors spread of withheld evidence, of things seen and not spoken, of reports closed too quickly. Theories bloomed, but all of them led back to the same silence. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been explained. The forest kept its secrets. As the years stretched on, the missing were not forgotten, but their absence became part of the land. New generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, the way children hear ghost tales before bed. They learned to fear the dark of the forest, to imagine shapes between the trees, to feel the press of silence in their chest. Even those who had no direct tie to the vanished felt it. The forest had claimed more than lives. It had claimed trust, safety, certainty. It had left behind a shadow that spread over everyone who lived within reach of its edge. The psychological deterioration was not dramatic. It was quiet, steady, persistent, the same way the forest wears down stone, the same way silence erodes laughter. Families carried their grief into every conversation, every holiday, every gathering where someone was missing from the table. Friends carried their absence into every memory, every photograph with an empty space where someone should have stood, and those who searched carried it into every step they took in the woods, always aware that they walked on ground that had consumed others. What haunts most is not the fear of death. It is the fear of not knowing. The fear of an unfinished story. The fear of silence where there should be sound. That is the weight the community bore and still bears. The forest did not only take bodies. It took certainty, and in its place it left shadows that cannot be driven away. And so the silence deepens even now. It lives not only in the woods, but in the hearts of those who remember, and memory, like the forest, does not forgive. The investigation did not end with the closing of reports. It never truly ends when the silence is louder than the evidence. Official explanations filled the first pages, rational, familiar, grounded in science and procedure. Authorities claimed the group had underestimated the forest. They suggested disorientation, dehydration, or hypothermia. The wilderness was unforgiving, and even the most prepared could fall victim to its dangers. Perhaps the campers had wandered in search of something, firewood, water, a path back, and simply never found their way. It was the kind of reasoning that could soothe paper, the kind that looked neat in typewritten lines. But it did not soothe the families. It did not answer why the belongings were untouched, why the tent stood open, why the dogs refused to follow the trail. Other officials suggested predators. A bear perhaps, drawn by the scent of food, or wolves moving silently through the trees. But the campsite bore no sign of intrusion. No claw marks, no tracks, no blood. Animals do not erase footprints. They do not leave tents unshredded and fires neatly arranged. To believe the predator theory required ignoring the evidence, and those who had walked the site could not ignore it. They knew something about the scene did not belong to ordinary wilderness. As explanations faltered, other theories grew. Some whispered of crime, the idea of another person lurking in the forest, waiting, watching, slipping silently into camp. It was not impossible. The woods were wide, and there were stories of hermits and drifters who vanished into their depths, living in shadows where no one could find them. But if it had been human hands, they left no trace. No cigarette butts, no discarded rope, no signs of struggle. The crime theory did not satisfy, yet it lingered, because the alternative, that the forest itself had taken them, was harder to accept. Folklore filled the silence where evidence failed. Locals spoke again of the old stories, the ones their grandparents had murmured when the fire was low. They said the forest had guardians, not spirits in the sense of religion, but something older, something bound to the land itself, figures without faces, tall and narrow, who moved only when unseen. Some swore these beings lured travelers away, pulling them deeper into the woods until they were never seen again. Others spoke of lights that hovered between the trees, leading the curious astray. To follow them was to vanish. To resist them was to hear whispers that could not be ignored. Paranormal investigators arrived in time, drawn by the gaps in the story. They brought equipment, recorders, cameras, devices meant to measure what cannot be measured. Some claimed success. They said they captured voices where no one was standing, faint words in languages no one recognized. They said their instruments spiked wildly at the campsite, as though something unseen pressed against the air. But skeptics dismissed it, calling it interference, imagination, wishful thinking dressed as evidence. And yet even skeptics admitted the feeling of unease when they stood in the clearing, as though the air itself remembered what had been taken. Conspiracy theories followed, because they always do. Some claimed government involvement, that the area was part of a secret experiment, that the missing had stumbled across something they were not meant to see. Others suggested the military had tested weapons deep in the forest, and the campers were caught in the aftermath. Still others spoke of hidden facilities, underground chambers, entrances disguised as nothing more than hills and brush. These theories flourished in whispers, in late-night discussions, in the minds of those who could not accept silence as an answer. But the most chilling theories came not from officials, not from outsiders, but from those who lived closest to the woods. They said the land itself was alive, not alive in the sense of roots and leaves, but alive with intention. They said the forest chose who entered and who left, that some who stepped across its threshold were never meant to return. They pointed to the history of disappearances, to the stories that stretched back centuries, always the same. Groups who entered, laughter echoing through the trees, never to be heard again. Campsites left untouched, belongings neatly arranged as if mocking the searchers. Always absence, never explanation. Investigators could not dismiss the strangeness. They documented the inconsistencies, they gathered the testimonies, but in the end their words faltered. The reports closed with the same hollow phrases: unresolved, no evidence of foul play, likely environmental causes. On paper, the case was finished. But in the minds of those who stood among the trees, it was anything but finished. Theories multiplied because they had to. Human beings cannot live with silence. They must fill it with something: reason, myth, fear, and in this case, silence was all that remained. The deeper one looks into the case, the less sense it makes. Rational explanations dissolve against the weight of absence. Folklore grows stronger, not weaker, because it fits the pattern better than science. Perhaps the truth lies in both, balanced uneasily between the human and the inhuman, between fact and something older than fact. Perhaps the theories are not meant to resolve the story, but to remind us that resolution is impossible. The forest does not yield truth. It only yields silence, and that silence lingers. Investigators left, files closed, equipment packed away. But the forest still waits. The clearing is still there. The trees still stand tall and unyielding, their shadows stretched across the ground. Theories remain, but none explain why the forest keeps what it takes. None explain why those who walk into its depths sometimes do not return. None explain why, even now, years later, the campsite feels less like abandonment and more like a threshold. A place where something crossed into the lives of the campers and pulled them away, leaving only questions, only silence, only fear. Theories multiply, but the truth does not change. They went into the forest. They did not come back. Time passed, but the silence never softened. The missing became more than names. They became a warning etched into the memory of the land, a shadow that stretched far beyond the forest itself. Families aged, their grief calcified into quiet routines, yet the absence remained raw. Their homes carried ghosts without graves, conversations without answers. And for those who stepped into the forest, whether searchers, wanderers, or the curious who came seeking thrill, The weight of that absence was waiting. It hung in the branches, it pressed in the soil, it lingered in the windless nights. The forest did not return what it had taken, and in doing so it gave something else. A reminder that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. The clearing still exists. Walkers find it sometimes by chance, sometimes because they search for it deliberately. The tent is gone, carried off long ago, but the ground bears the faint trace of where it stood. A circle of flattened earth that no grass fully reclaims. The fire pit is cold, stones scattered, though some swear they still see a glow faint as breath when the night deepens. Those who visit often describe the same sensation. The stillness is too heavy, the silence too sharp, as though the forest is waiting for them to speak first. Some leave quickly, unable to stand the wait. Others linger, listening, hoping for something, an answer, a voice, a sign. But what comes is always the same. Nothing, and yet nothing is not truly empty. Nothing becomes a sound when the imagination strains to fill it. Visitors swear they hear faint footsteps pacing behind them, slow and steady. Others claim to see shapes between the trunks. Indistinct, human in form, but wrong in movement, shifting just enough to suggest they are not alone. A few speak of whispers, faint and sharp, words they cannot repeat because they are certain they were not meant to hear them. These are dismissed as nerves, as tricks of solitude. But the forest does not care for dismissal. The forest has patience. The story of the missing campers is told now in fragments. It spreads in late-night conversations, in warnings given to children, in the cautious voices of those who live closest to the woods. Some treat it as folklore, another tale meant to frighten. Others speak it with reverence, as if invoking a truth that still breathes in the dark. Theories continue to shift and multiply, but all of them circle the same absence. It does not matter if it was hysteria or crime or something older than words. What matters is that they went into the forest and they did not return. That is the fact that no theory can erase. And the most disturbing truth is this: the pattern has not stopped. Even now, disappearances are whispered about. Hikers who fail to return, hunters who never come back to their cabins, travelers who wander too deep. The numbers are buried in reports, hidden behind phrases like lost or unaccounted for. Each case explained away, folded into statistics. But the pattern remains. The forest continues to take. Always the same silence. Always the same unanswered questions. There is a cruelty in how ordinary it looks. By daylight, the trees sway gently, shafts of sunlight piercing the canopy, the air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds return, insects hum, streams glisten. It looks alive, beautiful even, as though nothing unnatural could possibly dwell within it. That is the mask it wears. Beauty lures the unwary, convinces them that danger belongs only to stories. But the mask always slips, and when it does, it is too late. Those who study the case return to the same question. Why no trace? Why no struggle, no remains, no evidence? The simplest explanation is often repeated. The forest is too vast, too consuming. It hides what it takes, but others wonder if it is not hiding at all. If what it takes does not remain within its boundaries but goes somewhere else entirely, somewhere no search party can reach, somewhere that belongs to the forest alone. And so the story remains open, unresolved, its weight pressing harder with every telling. Because what happened once can happen again. It has happened again. It will happen again. The forest has patience, and patience ensures that silence never starves. Each year someone else will walk too far, step too deep, ignore the weight of rules spoken in whispers. And each year the silence will grow. Imagine it now. You walk the trail. The trees crowding above you, the air colder than it should be. You reach the clearing and the stillness wraps around you like a hand closing over your throat. You hear the crunch of pine needles behind you, steady, deliberate. You turn, but there is nothing. You tell yourself it is nerves, exhaustion, imagination. But deep down, in the part of you that still remembers what fear feels like in its purest form, you know the truth. You are not alone. You never were. The forest keeps what it takes. It does not explain. It does not release. It only watches, only waits, only reminds you that silence is not empty. It is full. And one day, perhaps sooner than you expect, you may be the next to vanish into that silence. The forest has not forgotten. It never will.